Good morning.
Morning.
Happy New Year to those of you who didn't see yesterday. It's the second day of the first month of the 22nd year of the second millennium. It's a lot of twos. In the new year, it is the tradition in Zen temples in particular to do special venerations of Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom, who's personified in our temple on the icon to the Buddha's right on this side. It's also referred to as the mother of the Buddha, the womb of the Buddha, the Buddha eye. And so for the first several days of the new year, there's special ceremonies that happen in venerating Prajnaparamita. And I know that many of you were here yesterday for the New Year's celebration, where we had a fanning of the large collection of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, which are here in these cases on either side. I always love coming back to the new year because I love Prajnaparamita so much. And it's a opportunity to delve into those teachings more deeply and to those practices in a powerful way. And sometimes I think about why is the new year, why is this particular teaching or this facet so emphasized in the new year? And I don't really have very clear conclusion about that. But it does feel like in each new year there is, even though it's kind of just made up, right? Like whenever we have the new year, it's kind of made up. But so is everything. So if we think about marking this cyclical time, and we do mark a time of the beginning of a new year, that in that beginning there's something about the foundations of our life, something about the foundation of how day-to-day living is, that is important to attend to. And when we think about the Prajnaparamita teachings, the womb of the Tatagathas or the mother of the Buddhas, these teachings have to do with the very foundation of how it is that we experience anything or how we experience everything. What is a very nature of consciousness, and in relationship to that nature of consciousness, how is it that we could perceive, how it is that we could recognize, right, in a way that fully expresses the innate freedom of being a conscious being and all of the possibilities that come with that freedom, the possibilities to be in really deep harmony with the world and a deep harmony with our own self, which is a challenge. I know you all know that. And coming into a new year, there's kind of like fresh start, and then there's also kind of like, oh my God, here we go again. And depending on your kind of viewpoint of things, oftentimes there's an increasing kind of weight that happens. And I think most of us are experiencing that now with the current worldly conditions that are also reflected in our own heart conditions, that there's a kind of heaviness. So important to return to these teachings that tell us something about this essential possibility or this essential freedom that we're all a part of. Like I said, that oftentimes Prajnaparamita is referred to as the mother of the Buddhas. This image of the womb and the child, that the prajna is the womb and the Bodhisattva is the child, and that these are inseparable. There's no way to have one without the other, that they come together. That's the image. And that if we are to investigate the walking of a bodhisattva with these feet, with our own feet, if we're going to investigate what it means to live this life of awakening. Right? The Buddha Shakyamuni, we have stories of thousands of lifetimes where this bodhisattva was investigating What is it to walk the walk of the Bodhisattva? What is it with the feet in that lifetime? Sometimes as a bird, sometimes as a non-feeted thing like a snake, right? As all kinds of different beings. This Bodhisattva was trying to live out the full implications of prajna, trying to live out the full implications of that essential freedom, that essential harmony of our deep being. And so tried many, many, many different things, but was always within that womb of prajna. This is the kind of understanding when we talk about Prajnaparamita as the mother of the Buddhas. Now, we oftentimes translate prajna as wisdom, which is maybe inevitable, but I also think is kind of unfortunate, because that word, probably any translation for a word as powerful as prajna will be unfortunate. My Muslim friend, he says, Quran not in Arabic isn't the Quran. That it's a translation of the Quran, right? So I've always really appreciated that this was, Gabriel didn't Gabriel through the prophet gave us the Quran, and those are the words, right? And then we trade them into another language. There's always a little bit of a shift. Right? Now, actually, Buddhism is kind of the opposite. The Buddha said, speak the Dharma in whatever language is there, right? So translation has always been fully embraced. But there's also this kind of downside, because when you come into another language, you have all the baggage of the word that you pick to represent this other word. So a word like wisdom, what do you think of, like owl and Winnie the Pooh? That's kind of our image of wisdom. And there's all kinds of really downsides to owl if you're a Winnie the Pooh fan. It's great and everything, but being up in the tree and just overlooking everything, and that's our way of thinking about wisdom often, or that it could be accumulated. That's the other thing, that wisdom comes with age, we say. Maybe. That's usually my response to that. I would say also wisdom really comes with youth. Out of the mouth of babes oftentimes is the most profound thing. So this word wisdom, in its origin, if we just use the word prajna, prajna is, some people want to translate it as gnosis as opposed to knowledge. And that's a word that's oftentimes used in relationship to the Gnostic tradition. So it has to do with a kind of awareness or a kind of mode of being, not just something that we would get and then we would hold on to, but a whole way of being, a whole way of perceiving, a whole way of acting. And prajna, I think it's important for us to think about prajna in this more flexible way, not just as a kind of thing we might accomplish, but a thing that's always a deep current that we are part of, actually, and we can wake up to being part of or not. Now, if we look to teachings about this investigation of the walking of the Bodhisattva, one of the places that, of course, we would turn to right away are the foundational teachings or core teachings. And sometimes those foundational or core teachings come in explanation. They come in kind of a philosophical text or some kind of, let me tell you what is the meaning of prajna, what's the meaning of compassion, But also we can look to our sacred stories. We can look to our myths. We can look to sutra. So our sutras are sacred stories about the unfolding of prajna through the lives of bodhisattvas. And when we look to those sacred stories, we get something different than an explanation. We get a kind of example, or we get a kind of symbol. We get a kind of story that can activate our own deep heart in a way that explanation can be helpful in that journey to our own deep heart, but explanation tends to kind of stay on the surface a little bit. And so as we engage the sutras of the Prajnaparamita, the large collection of the sutras here to either side, this is a very mini version, by the way. There will be 20 boxes. But we got the one that is has a little tiny print, like that dictionary where you have to have the magnifying glass. So those of you who are pre-cell phone living, you know that, where they had the little drawer on the top, and there's 2 volumes, like the unabridged something, maybe, and you get out. I loved that. I thought it was so cool. I would go to Powell's Book when I was a kid, and I would always look at those, but they're really expensive, and I couldn't afford it, and I didn't know what I would do with it, even if I had it. But I always thought that was cool. So our version has some regular printing, and then these tiny printing, so we can get all 600 volumes into 60 volumes. So that's the long Prajnaparamita. But mostly when we're studying the Prajnaparamita Sutra, the time that we encounter it the most in this temple, and I would say in most Mahayana temples, in the recitation of the Heart of Great Perfect Wisdom Sutra, which we recited maybe 30 or 40 minutes ago. Right? So that is referred to as the Heart Sutra. It's one of the shortest versions of the Prajnaparamita. The Prajnaparamita among sutras is unique in this way that there are all kinds of lengths. So it's all referred to as Prajnaparamita sutras, but this long one, which is 100, is referred to as a Prajnaparamita in 100,000 lines, or the Heart Sutra, which is Prajnaparamita in 100 lines. They're all the same teaching, right? But they're just kind of like unfolded or folded together, right? But all the exact same teaching comes to us. But it comes to us in these different sizes. And it's said to be, the fancy word that someone taught me a long time ago is scale invariant. It means whatever scale you look at it, it's the same teaching. Right? But you can refer to it on these different scales. The shortest Prajnaparamita Sutra is the Prajnaparamita in 1 syllable. So it's just 1 syllable. Ah. Now they say 1 syllable, there's a little introduction, and then and then it's over with. Yeah. So all the way down to 1 syllable, and then all the way up to the whole universe, we could say. Even the 100,000 lines is a kind of a contraction of the truth of this womb of the Tatagathas. In the Heart Sutra, if we just read that very first section, I'm going to talk about it a little bit. So if you have the sutra book with you, you might want to look at it. I'm only going to talk about the first stanza, though. Avalokitasvara Bodhisattva, when deeply practicing Prajnaparamita, clearly saw that all 5 aggregates are empty and thus relieved all suffering. I take it back, I'll probably only talk about the half of the first stanza, in which Avalokitasvara Bodhisattva is deeply practicing Prajnaparamita. So Avalokitasvara is the Bodhisattva of compassion. Probably the most, I would say, not most popular, most favorite, everyone's favorite Bodhisattva. And it shows up as the Dalai Lama, for example, right? Who doesn't love the Dalai Lama? And is a great example of this deep popularity of Avalokitesvara. I'm saying that in kind of a funny way, but there's a deep current of this Bodhisattva showing up all over the place in the Buddhist world. If you come in this door from Garfield into the temple, there's a Kuan Yin or Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva that is standing there in a beautiful standing position, pouring out the nectar of compassion. We have a Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokitesvara, of 1,000 arms that will go here on the Buddha's right. But has had a little bit transportation problems from China over the past year. Has been came to LA once and then went back. And now I'm trying to get that guy to send it again, but he's a little resistant. Or evasive, not resistant, evasive. So anyway, we'll eventually. It's really hard to get mad about it, though, because it's Avalokitesvara, right? It's like, what am I going to do? If it was Prajna, maybe I would get some thunderbolt, anger or something. But I kind of feel like I'm in a little bit of a cosmic joke with the whole thing. Avalokitesvara means, one translation is regarder of the cries of the world. Regarder of the cries of the world. Kannon. That's one of the ways to pronounce the Chinese, the Japanese pronunciation of the Chinese. Kan means to perceive. It's not just sight. Okay, I use the word seeing a lot, or vision, but when I say that, I never mean the fleshy eye alone. Right? I mean all of our capacities to experience a phenomena. right? Experience of anything. This is eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, or in your mind, your heart. Those are all, we could say, a perceiving, a type of perceiving. Right? So the perceiver of the sounds of the world, kanzeon bodhisattva, right? The hearer of the sounds of the world, the regarder of the cries of the world, the bodhisattva who is trying to live out this life of prajna and does that through hearing the cries of the world. I think this is the central message of Mahayana Buddhism. To live out this life of the total possibility of being a conscious being, not through enacting it just for my own enjoyment or my own ease, but for all beings, that all beings are participating in that. All beings are of that same nature, and in fact, for me to truly wake up to that nature, it requires all other beings to also wake up to that nature as well. I can't do it by myself. So a sutra like this is pointing us at that kind of very fundamental thing. And Avalokitasvara becomes our example of this baby in the womb, right? To be birthed as a Buddha. This Bodhisattva has lived through countless eons practicing this practice of compassion. Now it says here that Avalokitasvara Bodhisattva, while deeply practicing Prajnaparamita, this is a translation we have, and this one side. In the Chinese, the characters could be translated as deeply practicing. That's a good way to translate it. And the committee who did this translation, for a committee translation, it's pretty good, by the way. Usually committee translations go really flat. They're super accurate, but they're kind of flat. But I think ours is pretty good. But this character for practice, it can be read as something that's to go. Is to practice, like to do something, but it also can mean to go. It can mean like to move, right? So moving deeply, if we look back at the Sanskrit, the word probably means something more like coursing, like deeply coursing in, deeply moving in, deeply flowing with, deeply journeying through. Right? Practice, that corresponds to much of what our kind of thin idea about what Zen Buddhism is about, that I'm going to practice meditation, right? But that's kind of shallow, right? I'm going to practice meditation. It's about me practicing meditation, me practicing meditation, subject, verb, object, like that kind of mindset, very strong. So it's nice to round this out a little bit, to think like, okay, it's not just that Avalokitasvara is practicing Prajnaparamita, but Avalokitasvara is completely immersed in, is completely held by, is completely flowing through this gnosis, through this fundamental nature of our consciousness in which all possibility is present. That's what we mean by practice, by the way. That's also what we mean by meditation. It's actually kind of high standard, you know. It's not just something I practice. Like, okay, I'm doing it. How do I know I do it? Because I'm sitting cross-legged on the floor, not talking. Right? But to practice meditation should be about this coursing. So we need the compassion, right? And we need the wisdom to figure out how to live out this prajna. We have to act through compassion. There's no other way to do it. From almost the oldest texts in Buddhism, there's a reference to the path being a path of the birds. There's a lot there. There's a lot in more modern day study of our psychology and archetypal psychology, where the bird comes up again and again. In so many cultures, in so many places, the bird has this very important place. Right? But we can think about compassion and wisdom as being the wings of that bird. The Bodhisattva is the bird. You have to have compassion and wisdom. You can't just have one. And I really like that example being used with the bird, because some things, like if it was like the bicycle, right? Then you say the front wheel's compassion and the back wheel's wisdom. That's great and everything. But you're like, well, what about unicycles? Some people get along okay on unicycles, right? It can kind of work. But with a bird, there's no one wing, no flight. That's just what one wing means, no flight. So there's always this balance within the bird of these two. And it's not a fixed wing, right? It's a dynamic encounter with space, with air, with wind, with temperature, which is happening for the bird to be able to navigate the sky. And of course, sometimes one gets relied on more than the other. I'm sure, I'm not a bird, but I'm thinking if you want to turn left, there's something you do with your right wing and your left wing that isn't the same, right? If you want to turn the other way, you do it. You want to go down, you want to go up, all these things. So it's a dynamic process that's always unfolding. Now, if we look at what is the wing of wisdom, what is the wing of Prashma, if we go to the, we don't recite this on Sunday mornings, but on weekday mornings, a couple of days a week, we recite a sutra known as the hymn to the perfection of wisdom, the mother of the Buddhas. And in that, there's a line that says, she does nothing about all dharmas. And when I teach about this sutra, that's the line that everyone asks questions about. It just messes with you so bad. You're like, but she's the mom. And she does nothing about all dharmas means things, anything, including you, right? Including any phenomena, anything. It says she does nothing about them. Nothing. Zero. And here it's the hymn to the mother of the Buddhas, right? So we're expecting this something else, but right there in the middle says she does nothing about all dharma. Simply by shining spontaneously, she guides to the spiritual path whatever beings have wandered into dangerous, negative, self-centered ways. I was going to say indulgent, but self-centered ways. Right? Simply by shining spontaneously, she guides to the spiritual path. All beings. Right? She doesn't do anything. That's the one wing. That's the womb. And then this other wing of compassion is Avalokitasvara. Avalokitasvara showing up in the Lotus Sutra, which isn't one of the Prajnaparamita sutras, but is another place where this beloved Bodhisattva's story is told. There's a chapter on Avalokitasvara Bodhisattva in the Lotus Sutra. And in this, the inexhaustible mind Bodhisattva, another Bodhisattva, asks the Buddha Shakyamuni, says, world honored one, why does regarder of the cries of the world Bodhisattva, that's Avalokitasvara, travel around in this world? How do they teach the Dharma for the sake of the living? What sort of power of skillful means do they have? The Buddha replied to inexhaustible mind Bodhisattva, if living beings in any land need someone in the body of a Buddha in order to be saved, regarder of the cries of the world Bodhisattva appears as a Buddha and teaches the Dharma for them. For those who need someone in the body of a Pratyeka Buddha in order to be saved, they appear as a Pratyeka Buddha and teach the Dharma for them. For those who need someone in the body of a Shravaka, these are the traditional, there's the fully enlightened Buddha, there's a solitary enlightened Buddha, that's a Pratyeka Buddha, and a Shravaka, which is like a hearer of the teachings. They become arhats, very close disciples of the Buddha. So it says that the Avalokitasvara appears as Shravaka to teach them. Okay, so that part all kind of makes sense. Yeah, okay, Avalokitasvara can show up as all these things. And then you keep going, and it's for those who need someone in the body of a Brahma king. Avalokitasvara shows up as a Brahma king. For those who need someone in the body of Indra, Avalokitasvara shows up as Indra. For those who need someone in the body of Ishvara, shows up as Ishvara. For those who need someone in the body of Maheshvara, shows up as Maheshvara. For those who need someone in the body of a great general of heaven, Avalokitasvara shows up as a great general of heaven. And it goes on like kind of down the list. For those who need someone in the body of a high official, the high official. For those who need someone in the body of a Brahmin. For those who need someone in the body of a monk, a nun, a layman, or a laywoman. For those who need someone in the body of a partner of an elder. For those who need someone in the body of a boy or girl. For those who need someone in the body of a heavenly being, or a dragon, or a satyr, or a centaur, or a shura, or a griffin, or a chimera, or a python, or a human, or a non-human. Avalokitesvara is all of those things. Inexhaustible mind, Bodhisattva, is asking this question. Inexhaustible mind. It's chasing after every detail, every little part of existence, is saying, what is compassion? And Avalokitesvara, Bodhisattva's practice is presented. So no matter what is needed there, this Bodhisattva will show up in whatever body is needed for the teaching to be able to flow. Okay? So, she does nothing about all dharmas simply by shining spontaneously. Showing up for every kind of being in the way that they need to be showed up for. These become the nature of what it means to course in prajna. In this way, the Bodhisattva coursing through prajna is alive through the heart of all beings. And that's just Avalokitesvara coursing in prajna. But if Avalokitesvara is coursing in prajna, that means that this coursing is in all beings, because Avalokitesvara leaves no being out. This is a kind of, it's not exactly esoteric, but it's just the way that the text becomes when we pay more and more attention to it, and then when we try to live it out with our own lives. How do I meet the circumstances of this life? How do I meet the beings of this life? You can see from this that coursing is not some kind of like melting into unity, which is so often the kind of spiritual suicide that we long for. How easy it would be if what spirituality meant was a kind of meditation that would allow you to suspend all of your affairs. If all of the problems of a human life, of all of the challenges of a human life, could simply fade away into the unperturbed bliss of perfect concentration. But you see how you're giving up then. You're really, this is a big problem for people who are spiritually inclined, because we have that yearning for this type of I'll call it like the warm bath, which is great, by the way. Nothing against warm baths. I love warm baths. Actually, I like hot baths. That are not too hot, just the kind you can stay in really long, but anyway, you get the picture. So I really like baths. But the problem is, if we think the bath is the solution, then we just become totally inactive. And that can happen with our spiritual practice. I would say especially with Buddhism, because we have an offering of how to conduct yourself, to create equanimity in your mind and heart, how to harmonize with your mind and your heart. But if you create any little barrier of self-preservation, then that just feeds on itself. Your own personal cultivation of personal harmony can become a kind of trap. Right? It can become a kind of like, well, I'm feeling pretty good. Don't know about you all. That's what happens, right? We have this little, and then the meditation, the other kinds of practices that we do, I create a kind of a really good place for myself. But how does it connect with other beings? We should always be thinking about that, right? So this coursing in prajna is not melting into a unity where I get to forget about all these kinds of problems, right? It's a full aliveness. In the Heart Sutra, it says that Bodhisattvas coursing in Prajnaparamita are without fear. Now that can be taken as a very kind of heroic statement, like, oh, they're the ones who are beyond fear, unlike the rest of us. But we can also take it as an instruction for practice, that when we create this division, then the calm place we want to stay there, and we become increasingly afraid of the things that are challenging. And this teaching says, no, you are embraced, and because you are embraced, you can meet the challenges. You actually have what it takes. You have what it takes to meet the challenges. You may need some help. You may need instruction, and these sutras are full of those stories of people getting instruction, right? In this case, the immeasurable mind Bodhisattva, who's a great Bodhisattva, right, is getting help from the Buddha, getting clarified. What is it? What is this practice of compassion? Right? So of course we need help, right? But we also can get help, and we have the capacity to meet all of these kind of challenges. Now, I'll just say one little thing about preview of next week. I'm going to talk about this for a few weeks, I think, in January, and then I'll have some time for some questions. The next line, or the next part of that line, says, Avalokitasvara Bodhisattva, while deeply practicing Prajnaparamita, saw that all 5 aggregates are empty, and thus relieved all suffering. This seeing, sometimes we would say clearly saw. That's what our translation is. But that word clearly can also mean illuminate. So the seeing of the Bodhisattva here is not just the Bodhisattva is really, really sharp, and so saw it the correct way. That's one implication. But the other implication is the seeing of the Bodhisattva was an illumination. Right? That Avalokitasvara's seeing, the seeing with compassion, is an illumination, which means things can be seen in a different way. The way that compassion sees is different than the way that our addiction to objectification sees. We are addicted to objectifying. Again, subject, verb, object, right? Subject, object, connected with a verb. That's how we conscious the world so much. That's how we create our experience of the world so much. I'm not saying you consciously create it that way. You're addicted, right? Me too. And so we do it very naturally. And so here we have this teaching about clear seeing, about illuminated seeing, about a seeing which isn't the seeing of subject and object. This is why Avalokitasvara can say that the 5 skandhas, which are what any being is made up of, are empty. Which is not to say they're meaningless, it's to say they're completely interdependent. Right? Seeing that whatever object that Avalokitasvara beholds is it's not just an independent thing that Avalokitasvara has to wrestle with. Avalokitesvara's illumination reveals that all those beings are completely interpenetrated. So the freedom of my being is revealed in that illumination. How do I respond? I'm going to talk a lot about more of that tomorrow. I'm going too far into next week's talk. Anyway, that's what I have. Any questions or points of clarification?
Hey, Joe. One of the things that I found especially touching about your teaching on kind of interfaith matters is a kind of like negation of essentialism. Essentially, not all faiths are the same.
Yeah.
By listening to this talk today, if the Prajnaparamita sutras can be reduced to one syllable, and that syllable is also venerated by other spiritual traditions. If Avalokitasvara can show up as a Brahma king or Ishvara, or maybe some kind of religious figure of the current religion today, does that open like a risk of essentializing things in our view?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think where I find the difference between essentializing it and this kind of broad mindedness is when we try to explain, or we try to create a framework in which we're going to, looking for a word here, we're going to rectify all of these different traditions with a grand explanation of their unity. To me, that's where the essentializing comes in. I also don't think it's so clean as they're all just kind of sitting in their own place and we need to choose one. Obviously Buddhism, but I don't think that's true either. There's this beautiful, messy thing. But messy kind of in the way that the whole world's messy, with dirt and mud and worms and grass and trees and sky, and it all kind of goes together. So I have a real problem with kind of perennialist teachings of many of the people who are like representatives of that tradition, like Houston Smith. I love. Right, but the idea that we could talk about there being sort of one kind of true spirit and God, and then these are all just different manifestations, I think that brings us into a dismissal, like you were saying, of different traditions. But I think what we can do is simply appreciate and encounter those various teachings. If I go to a church, actually, I don't usually prostrate because I don't want to freak people out. But I feel like I can offer a respect, not just a respect like, well, you're a religion, I need to respect you because you're also a religion, but like a genuine veneration of something which is touching the hearts of other people, which doesn't touch my heart in the same way, but I can appreciate it. So it's more about the activity of care than about kind of an explanation. In the Lotus Sutra, that's one thing I really love about the Lotus Sutra, is it just won't let us, it never will give that kind of, they'll never say like, the Buddha's wisdom is infinite and all things relate back to it. It never will say that, because that's where you start having this explanation in which you can just deconstruct the particularities of things and relate it back to the unity. And it will always be these stories that go on forever about all the different ways that it could happen. Does that respond to your question?
Hey, Joe.
Hey.
Hey, Joe. I'm in Tatagathas' book, Abbot, the first three syllables, first three vowels of the Avalokitasvara means to look down. So are we to take Avalokitasvara as a sky god, like in the Roman, or as a symbol of an inherent quality which we have?
Yeah. I think the latter. There's some, I just was reading a scholarly article this morning when I was looking up something about the derivation of the name Avalokitasvara, about the translation is always an issue. And so one interpretation of the origin of the name is to look down. But that has to do with some way of reading Sanskrit, which I don't understand. The scholar whose article I printed out seems to understand and makes the case that that's kind of a problematic translation, to look down. But as a person who's trying to live the life of a bodhisattva and looking at Avalokitasvara or receiving Avalokitesvara's life as a teaching for my own inquiry, the way that I hear the name is that if looking down means that I am removed from, that I'm sort of looking down in pity, then I don't find that to be really clear prajna practice. That the place in which I feel like a real compassion can flow through my life is when I could never quite tell which way the compassion is flowing. I couldn't say that compassion is flowing from me to you, that it is always has a bi-directional. That's my experience of it. So if I were to say how to translate it, even though I don't understand Sanskrit, I would say, well, I think it's not a good translation. I would use that justification for it not being such a good translation. But that this is the very nature of our heart, of our mind, that is totally inclusive.
Also, the Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva is depicted as a male and as a female, or both at the same time.
Yep.
Which would make it then a sky god.
I don't think that means that it makes Avalokitesvara a sky god. I think that it's this is in a classical Buddhist philosophy. There are different levels of heavens, or I'd say cosmology, not philosophy. There are different levels of heaven, and Avalokitesvara spends a lot of time in the heaven of complete contentment, which is one of those levels. And in that realm, there's no gender. And so, but Avalokitesvara can also show up in all of these other realms, and in showing up in all those other realms, may show up gendered or non-gendered. So that's the way I take that. Does it relate to the experience of some spiritual traditions that have sky gods? Sure, I think there could be some relation, but I don't think we should conflate them.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Hi.
During Sagaki, you talked about, I'm wondering, I don't know like how much I interpreted this and then misremembering because like my own wanting to.
Or building meaning out of what you've experienced.
I don't know how much is the case.
Yeah.
That is the case, but you told the story of the arrival of Flaming Mouth Demon being this great bringer of Avalokitesvara. And you said something that not all demons are Avalokitesvara. And you said this is very important. What's going on there?
Yeah. Well, that's our practice. That's really. I mean, it's very sharp to see into that, and to remember that, and then to have it as a question. So in that story, the Ananda is visited by a demon named Anku, who is like the chief of the hungry ghosts, right? And an understanding of who Anku is Anku is an emanation of Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva, but he's showing up here to Ananda in a way that's really challenging. Right? That Avalokitesvara doesn't always show up with a kind of sweet face. That's part of what the teaching there is. But it is also that in our deep like a quietness, which Ananda was in retreat, right? It's the middle of the night. In that settled place, faces may appear to us. And the faces that appear to us may be Avalokitasvara presenting meeting us with the Dharma in a really profound way that may be very difficult as a demon. We should look for that. We should find the Avalokitasvara in the difficult experiences. The problem is if we create the idea that all difficult experiences are Avalokitasvara showing up to teach me something, it's very easy for us then to just try to explain the difficulties as something that is actually positive. And there's a funny psychological, emotional little twist that can happen that's sort of self-abusive. We can turn that over and over again and kind of relish that difficulty in a way that's not healthy. So our job is not to try to see Anku as something different than Anku, but our job is to try to see Avalokitasvara through Anku and not try to turn Anku into Avalokitasvara. And that kind of sorting out in our heart of experience is really so much about what practice is, what's happening in practice. We're sitting and becoming more and more and more intimate with our own being, which is to say the world reflected in ourselves, and ourselves reflected in the world. And we're going to come across all kinds of difficulties there. And so looking for the way that there's wisdom showing up through the compassion of those beings that are appearing is continual process. We can't just kind of label it and say, well, the difficulty is just Avalokitasvara. So, it reminds me a little of, I appreciated being raised in a household. My mom would always say, well, everything happens for a reason. Right? And I appreciate that like there's a certain tone to that, which was very comforting. It wasn't like everything happens for a reason, go to your room and shut up about it. It was, which it could have been that way. It was always, everything happens for a reason. She said it to comfort us. And it always was accompanied with intimacy and care. But there's a way you can take that everything happens for a reason, which is really, really big problem. It's just like, well, everything happens to you for a reason, right? And then anything that happens just becomes a kind of like reaffirmation of your own problem, like my essential nature is problematic. And a similar thing can happen in that realm. On the practical level, I would say it's spiritually what's important is keep venerating Avalokitasvara, which is different than trying to explain things as Avalokitasvara. And then there's a gateway that opens up there. So next week we will talk about seeing.
This and all our teachings are offered free of charge. If you would like to make a donation, please visit our website at buddhaeye.org and click the donate button at the top of the page. Thanks.